Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Tax was step one, and that's sensible for us for obvious reasons as well. Is this anti-business? Far from it. As David Cameron said at Davos, the only way we can have low corporate taxes is if all companies pay them. And at the moment, some companies have so pushed the margins that it's voluntary for them. The way to tackle that is not a big dose of morality on companies, though I do think companies have over the years erred, but the right thing to do is get the rules to catch up. The rules have to embody reasonable ethical standards, and at the moment they don't. They let companies get away with conduct which is not socially legitimate but is legal. So that's the tax agenda. And then there's a transparency agenda in two parts. One is to get to the bottom of who actually owns companies. And the key reason we have to do this is that at the moment the concealed ownership of companies provides the getaway car for corruption. It's the getaway car for bribes. And that is the easiest point at which to make bribery a lot harder. If we could crack open the secrecy havens, we could link bank deposits to taxpayers in poor countries, and that would make corruption very much harder. It would be harder to accept a bribe. And we've made enormous progress on that at the G8 meeting. It's the first time ever all the overseas territories, for example, had actually met together with the Prime Minister, and they agreed to a transparency agenda. The second part of the transparency agenda, so the first part was beneficial ownership. The second part is transparency in the reporting of the revenues that resource extraction companies pay. And that was a two-pronged approach. One is to get the G8 countries to stop saying, do as I say, and make the much more convincing statement, do as I do. And so a lot of the G8 countries have now signed up to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. For the last 10 years, we've been in the anomalous and frankly ridiculous position of having launched it, but never ourselves signed it. So that's a major advance, and this was widely recognized by African governments. And so I think you'll see this has now become, in effect, almost overnight, the global standard. The other prong on transparency in revenues is to make mandatory the reporting of those revenues. So it's a legal requirement, and that's now happened in all the countries of Europe and all the companies in North America, Canada and America, which is a huge step forward. And obviously, that's only the first stage. The sensible thing now is for companies to stop pushing back against this and to make it global. The right forum for that is the G20. The G8 countries cannot set the agenda for the G20, but unless the G8 countries put their house in order, there was no hope that the G20 would. Final element of the G8 was trade, and we had this dramatic move to start a process of getting Europe and North America into a common liberal trade regime, which I think is brilliant, at a time when we're both facing competition from the East. It's absurd that we shoot ourselves in the foot by internal trade barriers within the West. But the important step was then to do something equivalent for African trade. And Africa's big ambition is both to integrate its own trade and to diversify its trade beyond natural resource extraction in its trade with the developed world. And for that, above all, Africa needs infrastructure. The key barriers, far more important than the residual trade barriers, are logistics. Africa needs power and it needs transport. And that costs an enormous amount of money, far more than aid could possibly do. And so the big innovation of this G8 has been to say, let us start the process by which we can crack open developed country private capital, the huge trillions of dollars of private capital markets, and make those accessible for African infrastructure and infrastructure in other poor economies. And that is something waiting to happen.
It's always very difficult to follow Paul Collier, who is the sort of godfather of the centre-right approach to development that the coalition government has adopted. And both the Prime Minister and I describe ourselves privately as Collier wonks. And he has had a tremendous effect on the thinking of the government, and actually wider than that, of the international community about development. Turning to the issue of trade, transparency and tax, which Paul has talked about, let me just add a few thoughts on each of those. First of all, on trade, throughout my time as the Shadow Development Secretary and the Development Secretary, I was hugely struck by the importance to the poorest people in the world of the failures of the WTO and the failure to conclude the Doha round. It is undoubtedly true that free and fair trade, economic growth, the work of the private sector, having a job, these are the things that will make the most immediate impact on the lives of the poorest people in the world, and freeing up the international trading system is an agenda which has not been completed, has not been progressed, and we need to put an awful lot more effort into that. On transparency and tax, I agree with what Paul has said. I think that on tax, the constellation has suddenly aligned in an extraordinary way. The ancient view in the developed world that there is, particularly in Britain, that there is a difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. One is legal, one is not. Those differences have now broken down. And I think there is a fair point to be made, which many of the international businesses make, which is that they need clear rules because they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to minimize the amount of tax they pay. I think that that is going to be replaced by a more moral, more ethical approach, and I think that it's very important that governments and politicians and ministers catch up with that and codify this in a way that reduces and hopefully eliminates the doubt, which if you are the CEO of a big international, multinational company at the moment, inevitably is part of all of this. I think that the absolutely critical point that comes out of Paul's book, if I may advertise one of his books, The Plundered Planet, which is an excellent book, which explains very clearly the 7 or so steps for the proper development and exploitation of mineral resources owned by the country which hosts them. It is an irony that in our world today, some of the richest and most valuable real estate has on top of it some of the poorest people in the world, and Afghanistan is not a bad example. And you know, if there is peace in Afghanistan, how does this incredibly poor country enable its people to be lifted out of poverty? It is at least in part that there is a transparent and proper development of the mineral resources, a removal of asymmetric knowledge where the developer and the government don't know the same things. There's transparency in that knowledge. There's then a deal which splits the profit from the exploitation of that mineral wealth between the company and the shareholders of that company who are developing it on the one hand, and the state which owns it on the other. And then the transparent demonstration of what the income for the state is, whether it is spent on consumption or investment, so that everyone can see what is happening to that wealth. Just to add a couple of other points on all of this. On transparency, of course, the British government has, along with the Swedish government, has led the way on development. All expenditure over £500 is now put into the public domain through the website, driving transparency through the international system and through the British development system too. It was this government, after all, which introduced the Bribery Act, which has an important effect on all of this. The Chinese government has themselves now introduced a Bribery Act as well, and it may not yet be working perfectly, but it shows that the international system understands the importance of all of this. Final 2 points. I think if you look at the reforms of CDC, the British government's 100% owned Development Finance Institute, you can see how that can really be driven through to help the poorest people in the world through showing the deployment of patient capital that doesn't require an immediate commercial return, and pioneer capital, which is going to places where the magic of the private sector is not yet exercised. And I would say that in terms of self-reproach and unfinished business, the importance of harnessing the remittance system around the world to the benefit of the countries where remittancing takes place is very much unfinished business, where we need a much stronger and better initiative in the future. And trying to marry that together with microfinance in the interest of the security of the people who are remittancing and also the economic growth in a poor country, I think is a very important agenda which we have yet really to address.
We sort of take it for granted now, but the period of globalization that we've seen since the late 80s, early 90s has been the most intense period of integration of the global economy in sort of deep integration in various ways that we've seen since the latter part of the 19th century. But up until about the early 1990s, globalization was confined to some fairly sort of what look with hindsight modest areas of trade and investment between a small number of countries in the world economy. And what happened in the early 1990s is the vast bulk of the people in the world economy joined the global economic system in various ways. And we now have the situation where 97% of the world's population live in an economy which is a member of the World Trade Organization, which, whatever you think about the World Trade Organization, is quite an important symbol of how integrated we are now. And actually what we've discovered, I think, through this process of globalization, it's become a powerful engine of development for many economies around the world. I don't think this was perhaps intended, though economists said, well, you know, trade is good and trade should bring economic development. But as countries like China and India and many of the economies in Africa have integrated into the world economic system, they've seen quite significant benefits. So the good news is we've created this big global engine for economic development, and it has seen quite beneficial developments in many developing and emerging economies. But I think I would highlight three sort of downsides that we've seen. First of all, I think in the Western economies, this is something that was identified in the 1990s, there's a potential for widening inequality as manufacturing companies go and move into low-cost production locations, take advantage of low labor costs. The people who are not so skilled and are relying on basic manual labor to earn their income in Western economies are effectively competing with some very low labor costs across the world. And it's been observed that in many economies inequality has increased over the 1990s and 2000s. And I think this is partly due to the fact that this globalization has created winners and losers in the Western economies. The second byproduct is that we've seen increased volatility across the global economic system. And while globalization only played a part, I think, in the global financial crisis, it certainly did play a part in creating the conditions in which the global financial crisis emerged in 2007-8, partly because it masked some of the problems that were emerging in the late 1990s and early 2000s. We've also seen a lot of volatility in commodity prices and energy prices. We've seen upward pressure on commodity price and energy prices that have benefited many economies in Africa as Paul has pointed out. We've also seen increased volatility in those markets. And the third issue I think we're grappling with is that if you create a big global economic system, it's very hard to control your fortunes in a part of it, in a country, when you're being buffeted around by these big global forces. It's actually quite hard for countries to control their own destiny and control their own affairs in a world that's very heavily influenced by these big global forces. And I would just make 3 points in relation to the current G8 agenda and some of the issues that are being discussed now. The first point is that if you've got a global economic system, we are going to need some way or other to create better systems of international coordination and cooperation to manage it. And the infrastructure that we've inherited is basically something that was put in place after the Second World War with the IMF and the World Bank, the United Nations, and various organizations that are not at all well adapted to managing this highly integrated global economy. So we've improvised. And we've found the G20, which only came into being in the late 1990s, and it's helped a bit. But I think we need to, within the international community, we need to focus in on a much better and regular structure of international coordination and cooperation than we currently have. So when I look at the G8 meeting, I think, well, the G8 is just about 50% of the world's GDP, but it misses out most of the most vibrant part of the world economy, which is the Asia-Pacific region. I'm not sure the G8 is actually the right forum. I was hoping, perhaps before these G8 meetings, the G8 would wind itself up and focus more on the G20. Now, there may be members of the panel who are more optimistic about what the G8 can achieve. But if we've got competing institutional frameworks and structures, we're not going to get the right outcome in terms of international decisions. So I would focus on the G20 and perhaps even try and expand beyond the G20 to a broader structure. The second issue is that there are some countries and parts of the world that are going to get left behind, even though the global economy creates a lot of opportunities for developing and emerging economies. Some countries are not well connected to the world economy. Some countries have a bad inheritance. They have tensions between racial groups. They have bad governance. And thirdly, some countries have governments and institutions that are not helping them to integrate into this sort of the potential of the world economy. Now, I think the answer to these problems is not to try and roll back the tide of globalization and say, well, we've got to be more protectionist. I think we have to find ways of helping countries that have disadvantages to integrate and benefit from the opportunities in the world economy. And I think that's very much what the UK government's agenda is about. But it has to be quite selective, and it has to be focused, it has to recognize that there are things that countries need to do to help themselves in terms of their own governance and institutions, as well as what we need to do. My final point is in relation to this vexed issue of taxation, which I think is in danger of becoming a potential sort of scapegoat or something to focus on as a sort of knocking point. But I'm not sure that tax is at the heart of the problems that we need to address, though I think there are some important issues on the tax front. First point to notice is that companies have two roles in the tax system. They obviously have to pay taxes on their profits, and in most countries they're required to do that. But they're big tax collectors for other forms of taxation like income tax and VAT. And actually governments working with companies to have effective and efficient tax systems in those areas is very important. But I see three issues underpinning the debate that we're having on taxation at the moment. The first is the globalization of the economy that I've talked about means that you can't pin down so easily where a company, which may be an international entity, generates its profits, and where those profits should therefore sit in for tax reasons. And governments, in fact, they're both poachers and gamekeepers in this debate, because they're both trying to attract corporate activity through making tax systems more attractive, at the same time as wanting to make sure that companies pay the right amount of tax in their jurisdiction. I think a second issue, which hasn't, I don't think, been discussed enough, is what I call the virtualization of economic activity. We're moving towards a more service sector economy, and if you look at some of the companies that found themselves in the spotlight in terms of tax, like Google, Facebook, even Starbucks, these are companies where their profits are not so much attached to something physical and tangible. It's more intangible and virtual. And so the way in which our tax structures are developed and applied need to keep up with that. We need to find a way of capturing those forms of economic activity properly. And I think the third area that I would highlight on tax is that I can't think in the UK that we've had a really thorough reform of our tax system since the 1980s, when Nigel Lawson was the Chancellor. And across the world, tax systems have become increasingly complex, and that opens up the possibility of taking advantage of different tax allowances, tax loopholes, differential rates of tax. And I think there's a challenge for tax authorities around the world. Yes, they should be challenging companies to be more transparent in terms of their operations, but we need a new wave of tax reform, in my view, to ensure that tax systems are themselves simpler and easier to comply with. And with that, that should come, hopefully, lower tax rates, because a broader base can raise the same amount of money from with a lower tax rate. So there's some broad thoughts about where we are in this debate, and look forward to listening to your questions.
Thank you, Andrew.